Well, welcome to this refresher training for mentors webinar. We're going to be covering a few different things today, but first of all, let's just have a look at some of the little bit of interactivity that's built in. Now, I'm going to assign privileges. Let's just have a go. Here we go. So everybody should have had a toolbar pop up now. It's got an arrow on it as well as a T for text. So if you click on the arrow, you'll find that you get an arrow like this when you click on the screen. So the toolbar will probably be up near the top of the screen here. Send me a message in the chat if you can't see that, and I'll have another look. But that's where it should be. So if you have an arrow, you can now use it to point around the screen as I am. That's it. Well done, Luciana. There are various ways that the session can be interactive. The first is to use the arrow to point to, for instance, which part of the pie chart applies to you. There is another way, which I'll just demonstrate. So, for example, if I wanted a contribution from someone about something, then, I'll have a table and I can say, okay, everyone claim a line, and you claim a line like that. And then using the text option, you can then add in your answer. There we go. For example, what did you have for breakfast? So I don't know if Luciana or Alex want to give that a go, or if anyone else wants to try that out. Everybody, there we go, Neil's got it. Everyone should have the ability to annotate and generally scribble all over the screen if they truly wish to. Now, naturally, at this point, they've just started some sort of major machinery outside, which is going to cause a bit of problems, but hopefully you can still hear me and we'll just carry on through that. Okay, so as we go through, you're welcome to submit questions into the chat window. You'll find that down here, thereabouts on your screen. Do send them to everyone rather than privately, although you can send me private questions if you wish to. Brown flakes, honest, that's fine. Do submit questions as we go along. I'm going to close the chat window for now, just for my own view, because it's just awful to try and read and talk at the same time. Okay, what are we going to be covering today? Well, we'll be going through the basic idea behind the pathway, just very briefly, the pathway life cycle, deadlines and dates in general. We'll be talking about the stages and what the stage definitions mean and how they differ from the ones on the old pathway. We'll be talking about candidate records and what your candidate should be adding onto the system. And then we'll also be looking a little bit at the mentor review and also testing your candidate's knowledge. Now, I do have a bit of a cough. If it suddenly goes silent, I'll have muted my own microphone just to avoid myself deafening you. And I am surreptitiously eating a cough sweet as we go along. So if there's any odd sweet type noises, it's not hobnobs or anything interesting, honestly. So that's everything we're going to be covering. So let's get started. Well, before in fact we do get started, there are tons of resources online on the Institute's website. So if you go to landscapeinstitute.org, click on education and then click on pathway to chartership, you'll find absolutely loads of stuff there, including recordings of these webinars as they become available. The recording of this one and the one from Tuesday that was for candidates will be available from tomorrow lunchtime. So why is the pathway as it is? Well, in the 70s, this diagram was officially created and kind of started career development as we know it in its current form, or CPD in any case. And the CPD cycle is plan, do, reflect, record. Okay, the 4 elements to the traditional CPD cycle. What has become more and more common in recent years is that we've added feedback into the mix, and that's certainly what we've done on the pathway. So the vast majority of professional bodies will refer to the professional development cycle, or PD cycle, or CPD cycle, somewhere on their website, and certainly when they're talking about career development for members. So bearing in mind, plan, do, reflect, record, and then feedback, you can see where it is that the pathway actually came from. Because you've got planning, you've got doing and recording, then you've got reflecting as well as part of this, and then you've got feedback. With the mentor indeed reviewing and then feeding back. So, we've got plan, do, review, record, and feedback, all here in this pathway lifecycle. Everyone, of course, registers initially, all the candidates nominate their mentor. There's then the initial review, and then we get into the quarterly development cycle until you're ready to submit a notification, at which point the supervisor will approve that notification, we hope, and then the candidate, of course, will go to the exam. And I will be talking a little bit later on about assessing your candidate's readiness to take the exam. Now, the whole of the pathway life cycle is, of course, controlled by deadlines, and these are the bane of everyone's lives, including mine. But they don't just exist to annoy, they are really important. One of the things on the pathway is that the syllabus is quite explicit about the different knowledge areas that a candidate needs to cover during their time on the pathway. However, there are some implicit skills that candidates need to have as well, and one of the really important ones is time management. All professionals, not just landscape professionals, need to be able to show that they can stick to deadlines and be timely with their work, not waste time, and deliver things to budget, I think, most importantly nowadays. And that all depends on being aware of what the deadline is and making sure you don't miss it. I'm sure it's as important to you as it is to candidates on the pathway. So we have candidate submission deadlines, and these are always the last day of the quarter, midnight on the last day of the quarter. So we've got 31st of March, 30th of June, and so on. The next one coming up is, of course, quarter 3, and then we've got 30th of September, which is the last day of that quarter. Your deadline as mentors is 7 days later, so yours is always the 7th of the following month. So, for example, for quarter 3, your next deadline is 7th of October, midnight on the 7th of October. Supervisors, it's a bit of a mouthful to explain what their deadline is defined by, to say it's the first day of the second month of the next quarter. But essentially, they have 3 to 4 weeks after you have submitted to have a look at both your submission and the candidate's submission and submit their feedback for both of you. So, for example, for the quarter 3 that we're in at the moment, their deadline is the 1st of November. Now, we ask everybody to stick strictly to deadlines, and there's no submitting after deadlines unless there's grounds for an extension. So altogether, there are 3 grounds for extension. The first being that there has been a bereavement, okay, some tragedy that affects all of us sometimes. The second being that there has been a serious illness. Now, this isn't a cold or, overnight food poisoning. And we're talking about something that really stops you from being able to use a computer, so some sort of serious illness. It doesn't have to be just you that's ill. If you have a dependent, partner, elderly relative, and you're called away to look after them, that is grounds for extension as well. The third one is what is known in insurance circles as an act of God. So whenever a volcano erupts and stops aeroplanes flying, I've found, to my surprise, that there are always mentors nearby, especially if it's near a deadline. And such things do often stop them submitting on time and mean that extensions are required. So illnesses, bereavements, or acts of God, extensions will usually be given. And you don't need to provide evidence that these things have happened. We take it on trust because you're all charter members. You all abide by the code of conduct, and no one would ever think of lying to me. So deadlines are extremely important. There are, of course, also, and let me just clear these off, but there are, of course, also 2 additional deadlines, which are to do with the exams. So the deadlines for notifications that a candidate is ready to take the exam take place either in quarter 2, if the candidate wants to take the November exam, or in quarter 4, if the candidate wants to take the May exam. So these are the times by which you must submit a notification as part of your mentor review. You can submit them at any time of year. It's not a problem at all. It's just that that's the absolute last time you can submit it for the November exams and the last time you can submit it for the May exams. So it's important that you mark the submission deadlines in your diary so that they don't come as a surprise. There are always a few people, at least 1 or 2 each quarter, who are absolutely astonished to find themselves on holiday or even getting married or going on honeymoon. Now, in the UK, you need to give at least 2 weeks notice to get married, so it's difficult for this to come as a complete out of the blue thing, except possibly in Gretna Green, I'm not sure. Possibly if you nip off to Vegas, it could be done earlier. But you know, generally these things don't come as a huge surprise, and there is time to plan about if you've got things coming up that would mean that you need to submit early. Now, it is, of course, your candidate's responsibility to drive the process. It's the candidate's career that's at stake. It's their development that they're recording. But, you know, sometimes the candidates are a little bit distracted. They tend to be at that stage of life where relationships come and go, housing comes and goes, jobs come and go. And so there's often other things distracting them, possibly starting young families, buying first properties, that kind of thing. Even if they're not distracted with that kind of thing, they can just forget to stay in touch. So it's entirely fine for you to give them a nudge. It's useful to have regular update meetings between you and your candidate, but of course it depends on how much time you've got and also what stage of the process your candidate is actually at. And we'll be talking about this in a moment. Review your own workload as the deadline approaches. If you've got a big project that's due, lots of work isn't a reason for an extension. But if you know that you've got lots of work coming up and there's a big deadline happening alongside the deadline for the quarter, which, you know, does happen quite frequently because quarterly deadlines are not just pathway dependent, then do by all means submit early. You can submit as early as you need to. Ideally, your candidate will submit before you because it's difficult for you to have assessed their submission and their progress in the quarter if they're still developing and progressing during the quarter. But sometimes that might not necessarily happen. You can, though, submit. If you need to submit after a month of the quarter, then you can. It's not a problem at all. Just always make sure that you do submit your mentor review by the deadline. How to tell if you've submitted? Well, first of all, you'll get an email confirming that we've received your mentor review. And second of all, when you go in and log in, you'll see a message in the tasks menu saying that your next mentor review is due by the following quarter. Okay, if you're not seeing that, then you haven't actually submitted. And you've probably just saved it as a draft by mistake. So saving as a draft won't submit when the deadline passes. It'll in fact just be deleted, which is probably the worst case scenario. So essentially always mark the submission deadlines in your diary so they don't come as a surprise. So let's get those arrows out again. For those of you that weren't here right at the beginning, you'll know that you might have noticed you've got a toolbar somewhere up the top here. There should be an arrow which looks a certain amount like my arrow, but when you click on the screen, it'll have your name on it. When is it that your candidate actually submits? Okay, so let's say, think of last quarter, and, you know, did they submit a week before the deadline? Giving, you know, everyone plenty of time. Did they submit a day before the deadline? Were they on the deadline? Or were they not only on the deadline, but they were actually, you know, after 9 o'clock at night, they were still typing away. And, you know, we have had plenty of people who submit between 11:30 and midnight on the day of the deadline. And equally, if they haven't submitted at all, then go over there. So use your arrows and just let's have a quick survey of when everybody submitted. You just want to do that quickly. So Neil has a new candidate, that's fine. Aidan and Aidan's candidate leaving it a little bit late. Matthew, Claire, yours is slightly more organised. Eleanor, yeah, Eleanor's got one of the candidates I'm thinking of. So there's quite a few of you who are down here in the haven't yet area. So your candidate's presumably very new to the system. And in fact, there's another webinar next week called Mentoring for Beginners, where I'm going to go through some of this in more detail. So if you've got any questions after this webinar, of course, submit them in the chat window down here somewhere. But equally, you might want to dip into that webinar as well, either live or recorded later on. Okay, so thank you, everyone, for submitting and for giving your status there. I think certainly I wouldn't recommend ever that candidates leave it until the last minute. I even feel a bit nervous about them leaving it until the day of the deadline, because you never know when Sky are going to have their internet cable cut through by local mechanics or something. So I always think it's best to leave it a little bit before, if not a whole week, then a day or so before. But of course, you know, real life doesn't always go like that. Okay, managing your own workload. As I've been saying, know the deadlines and submit early if you need to. These regular meetings will mean that there are a few surprises for you and a few less calls to me saying, I'm really sorry, but I got married. And it's like, there's no need to apologize, but equally, I'm sorry you've missed your submission. And as I was saying, time management is a really important skill for your candidate to develop, so do make that clear to them. In terms of your candidate submission, there are 3 parts to it. So those of you whose candidates haven't submitted yet, do ask your candidates just to log in next time you meet up, if possible, and just show you the system from their point of view. You can see it, the outline of it in the what's it called? It's a user guide. That's it. The user guide for candidates, which is available on the Pathway website. But that's just an outline of it. The candidate can show it to you themselves. But the candidates have 3 parts in their submissions: development logs, projects, and the quarterly statement. And the important thing about these is that they need to be concise. You have to spend time reading these things. The supervisors have to spend time reading these things. And the examiners have to spend time reading these things. So whatever it is that your candidate is submitting, they need to be aware that they are using up the time of 3 chartered professionals at the end of the day to actually review what it is they've written. So they need to be aware of that and be responsible for using that time and make sure they're using it effectively, but without submitting reams of information that isn't really relevant. The development log, what was done is actually a minor part of the contents of the development log. So the development log is where the candidate captures how they have developed the knowledge and understanding that they have against the syllabus areas in that particular quarter. It also, as well as what they did being a minor part of it, they need to show reflection. So when I say that what they did is a minor part of it, what I mean is it's really what they learned that is important from this. That's what you're interested in. That's what the supervisor and examiner is interested in. So really what they've done can be captured in just a single sentence, maybe 2. Went to planning inquiry. That's fine. That's the description. You don't then need a blow-by-blow account of what happened, just enough to put it into context, and then what they learned after that. Now, this issue of reflection can be quite a complicated one, so I'm just going to go into that in a bit more detail. First of all, the development log, it's important that your candidate realises it's not supposed to be a diary or revision notes, and this is something I emphasise to the candidates myself. And candidates are much, much better than they have been in the past. It improves all the time. But some of them do still write a lot. And it's generally just out of nervousness. They don't want to miss anything. But it's always best to be succinct. And if there's not enough information, the supervisor will feed back on that and just ask them to provide a little bit more detail on what was going on. It's much more of a record of what was done and, most importantly, what was learned. Now, this issue of reflection, which I emphasise in all the candidate webinars, and indeed there's a webinar next week on just reflecting on your development, so half hour just on that topic. Why should they reflect? Well, first of all, it really adds value to what they've done. It means that they haven't just spent 3 hours in a seminar. They've come away from that and they've spent 10 minutes, maybe 15 minutes reflecting on what they learned during that seminar, and more importantly, how they can put it into use. Hopefully, thereby making your business more effective if they're working in the same business as yours, or making their own business more effective. It helps them provoke. It's very thought-provoking. It provides an opportunity for them to think how that particular area of knowledge fits in with other areas of knowledge, which is something the examiners are always looking for people to show during the exam. It helps them evaluate any objectives that they might have, that they might have set or you might have set in the quarterly statement or towards the end of the mentor review. It can also, as I say, help open up new perspectives and help them think about, pause for coughing. Help them think about how things fit together and what kind of tangents different areas might go off into that, again, could really be relevant to projects that they're working on or new work that's going to be coming into the office. helps them to develop an awareness, particularly of things, how things aren't just silos of information, how information does go across several different syllabus areas. And it also helps them enjoy little successes, because often when you get to the end of a big task, it can be more, you can end up feeling more relief that it's over than kind of happiness or celebration that it was successful. So we want to avoid that where possible, and reflection is a great way to do that. Equally, looking at a potentially more negative side of it, if they're, always not getting the result that they wanted, if something is never going quite as well as they wanted it to, if you feel, especially as their mentor with a kind of external perspective on things, that there's something that they're doing each time which is making something not quite as effective as it could be, by reflecting on that and reflecting perhaps with you, with their mentor, or encouraging your candidate to reflect on their own about it, it can help them avoid recurring mistakes. So for all these reasons and more, reflection is really useful. And so what I tend to advise candidates when they're doing their candidate records, their development log, is that they kind of split the development log up into 3 bits. The first bit, the smallest, is what they did. Okay, so they'll fill that in up here. So that's just a sentence or 2. Then you've got the reflection. Okay, so that's what they learned from it, where it might take them in the future, how it's made them aware that this area links into other areas, and then underneath the last section, maybe again just a sentence or so, is what happens next. Okay, so that's a good way to think about a development log, and that's the kind of thing that I'll tell candidates as well. So how many times a quarter do you meet with your candidates? Those participants that have just joined us, you should have an arrow up the top here, somewhere along the top here, or possibly just at the top up here, that is will actually give you something like that if you click on the screen. How many times a quarter do you meet with your candidate? Neil meets 2 to 4 times. Yeah, it's proving popular that time. Some people might have only just started meeting with their candidates, and so might not even have met once yet. Other people might have a candidate who is in particular need. But it looks like most people are down here in the 2 to 4 times. And, I'd say that was absolutely right. Now, some people will just be meeting once a quarter with the candidate, and that would be fine if your candidate is kind of in their stride. They're not brand new on the pathway. They've had had that initial phase where they were kind of gearing up and forming their knowledge of how the pathway worked. And now they're in the kind of storming phase where they're just going along fine. So that could be absolutely fine if your candidate's in that stage. However, if your candidate's just starting, or if they're starting to gear up towards the exam and things tend to become a bit more intensive, then they may well need more, frequent support. And that's when you start meeting 2 to 4 times. If you're doing mock exams, it might even become more than that in the month or so before the exam. So anyway, I can say that you're all doing very well here. And if it had been less than once, I probably should have put a 0 over here somewhere. But if it was less than once, that would certainly be a worry. So you're all having good contact with your candidate, and hopefully it's your candidate that's initiating that contact. So the process of reflection that you can discuss at these meetings, in fact, I'm going to skip over this bit because I want to spend a bit more time on the stage definitions. But essentially what I was saying before is about splitting up the development log of your candidate. This is a sample development log, which is actually back from 2001. And this candidate has since become chartered in 2001, in fact, I think it was. 2011. And what he used to do is he split each of his development logs up. So this is basically what I was describing to you when I drew my nice blue diagram earlier on. Okay, so this is that diagram, but actually in development log form. So I won't go into that in any more detail. I'll just move on to the stage definitions. But remember, if you've got any questions about that, then do ask them of me down in the chat window, which is down here. And I will be collecting those questions. I see there's none yet, but if anyone has any, then I will be collecting them at the end and answering them then. Okay, so let's move on to the stage definitions, because of course whatever your candidate does submit and whatever they do write, you in your meeting with them need to then think about where they come on the 0, 1, 2, 3 and now 4 scale. So let's look at those stage definitions in a bit more detail. We start off with 0 and 1. Now 0 hasn't really changed at all. It's basically you don't know anything at this point, or your candidate doesn't know anything at this point. This is when they've just graduated. They're not going to know terribly much about a particular syllabus area because they just haven't had any experience of that yet. They haven't read about it. They don't know what they don't know at this point. If we move on to stage 1, though, by this point, the candidate has acquired this basic knowledge, so they now know what it is that they don't know. And they understand basic concepts, but they haven't talked to you very much about applying them. So we're talking here about theoretical knowledge. Okay, so the definitions of stage 0 and stage 1 haven't really changed very much at all. It's really just the wording since the introduction of the new syllabus. If we move on to stage 2, stage 2 and stage 3 have changed a fair amount in their definition. So do bear this in mind when you're carrying out your first mental review on the new syllabus in time for the submission on the 7th of October. What we've got here is, let's look at stage 2 first. We've got a general knowledge with some experience of applying their knowledge. Now, they don't have to have this experience because it says you may have some experience, but they at least have an understanding of how you would apply this knowledge in practice. But they may still need to ask for advice. So this is someone who is still relatively junior in the office. They have been shown how to do something, have had someone sitting next to them doing it with them. Now they're doing it by themselves, but then they're bringing it effectively to someone else for them to go through and make sure it's all okay. So this is different from the old syllabus. It's quite a subtle difference, but it's a little bit lower than level 2 on the old syllabus because it's much more about how you may have some experience of applying your knowledge, whereas it was implied on the old syllabus that you were much more likely to have experience of this area. Stage 3 then, this one has changed. You have a thorough knowledge of the area and you have often applied your knowledge in practice. You take responsibility for most decisions, not all, but most, and you need little supervision or little advice when you're acting. So the key thing to emphasize here, I think, is that it's so important that mentors understand these stages. We'll be looking a little bit later on at what the standard is that's required to go to the exam, but essentially it's the same as it was on the old syllabus. Majority of stage 2s with some stage 3s. However, in the past, the candidate would pass the exam if they had the majority of stage 2s. You know, hopefully they would have some stage 3s, but it wasn't mandatory. However, on the new syllabus, candidate has to have a majority of stage 2s, but then they have to have stage 3s in the areas where they are, specializing or concentrating their work in. So if you mark your candidate as a stage 3 and they can't prove that they have stage 3 level of knowledge in the exam, they'll fail the exam. Even though they might be stage 2 in every single area, if you mark them as a 3 and they can't show that they are a 3, they will fail the exam. So the stage 3 that we have here is different to the stage 3 in the old syllabus. It's a little bit lower, and yet again, it's a little bit higher than the stage 2 that we had in the old syllabus. So it's kind of between the two because there used to be quite a gap between them. Just going to break for a moment to cough. Okay, so we'll come back to this, though, this status required for notification. Let's finish up the stage definitions first of all, because we have got this brand new stage 4. Now, stage 4 is going to be very, very rare that people become stage 4. You yourselves, I would be surprised if you had more than perhaps 2 or 3 stage 4s against the pathway syllabus. If you were going to be orally examined by someone now, I would be surprised if you had more than that, and that's perfectly normal. Supervisors and examiners are going to be exactly the same because, you know, it's very well possible. In fact, I can see that we have at least one examiner amongst us at the moment, but it's perfectly possible that some of you will be future supervisors and examiners as well. But it's perfectly normal for a mature professional to just have 2 or 3 level 4s, perhaps not even any. It's not expected that a person on the pathway will ever have a stage 4. It's been put in because we are in the midst of encouraging senior professionals who haven't become chartered in the past to now go forward and become chartered. So to do this, we wanted to make sure that their expertise could be acknowledged, so hence the addition of a stage 4. As I say, it is extremely rare that we will see it. Stage 4s are not required and not looked for in the exam. May occasionally, of course, have exam candidates who show them, but it's not something that the examiners will be looking for at all. So don't feel that you have to have 1 or 2 or 3 or even a whole load of stage 4s in your mentor reviews. And should you have a candidate that you feel is all stage 4s, I would certainly urge you to give me a ring and discuss them with me, because they are, you know, possibly a future super president of the Landscape Institute, and either that or we need to discuss how exactly we define a stage 4. So these are the 5 stages, effectively, that we have for candidates. And how should you really assess their knowledge? Well, the thing you need to always consider, and I say to candidates, it's never too early to start thinking about the exam. The thing you always need to consider is how would your candidate behave or perform in the exam. When you're thinking about where your candidate's level of knowledge is, when you're asking them questions, always ask yourself, could this candidate answer questions about this topic from people they don't know, who don't know them personally, who won't know what that thing that's on the tip of your tongue and you can't remember the name for it, oh, what is it? Oh, yes, clerk of works. They're not going to know what that thing or thingy means. And they're not going to give the benefit of the doubt either. When your candidate is in a stressful situation, so they're going to be under pressure, and when your candidate has limited time. So your candidate may be brilliant at doing environmental impact assessments, but could they explain how they should be done, not just how they're done in your office, but how they should be done to strangers in a pressured situation? Because that's the level of knowledge that they need to have. They at least need to talk about them theoretically to get that stage 2 level of knowledge. So these are always the questions that you should be asking yourself while you're trying to assess your candidate's knowledge. Always assess knowledge orally rather than written, because it's much easier to recall things when you're writing. I don't know if you've ever done this experiment where you try and write something at the same speed at which you talk, and unless you know shorthand, you know, there's a reason why shorthand exists, basically. It's impossible to write at the same speed as you talk unless you're a particularly slow speaker. So it's always easier for candidates to write down answers to questions, and also you can pause and think about it and then write a bit more. So always test knowledge orally. It's really important, especially when you consider that where you give a candidate a stage 3, they must be able to show that actually during the exam. So where sometimes there are issues is if you've worked with the candidates for some considerable time, or even not for very long, or if you've spent time with them socially, or if they've advised you on something, it's very easy to understand or to find that, yes, you know, the candidate must know about X, Y, and Z because they've advised me about it, or yes, they must know about this because they know about something else and I've seen them doing it in the office and so it must be fine, or even just that you've seen them doing it in the office. None of that means that they'll be able to answer theoretical questions about it. Okay, it's quite a different beast. When you have to actually describe precisely how you drive, instead of just getting in the car, starting it and driving off, you know, it's quite a difference. It's actually quite a technical process, but it becomes automatic when you're used to doing it. So again, very important to test orally that they can answer theoretical questions, not just rely on them having perhaps done it or helped you with it in the past. Again, it's not enough just to say to your candidate, do you know about this? And for them to say yes, because you need to be sure that they can actually answer detailed questions on it. So all things just to be aware of when you're assessing their knowledge. Your mentor reviews, we always advise you to comment on an area of the syllabus, even where there's been no change in stage. So you don't absolutely have to comment if you don't want to, where there's been no change between stage 0, 1, 2, and 3. But it's a good idea to, because unless the candidate's done nothing in that area, of course, in which case it's not needed. Certainly, wherever there's been a change of stage, like from 0 to 1 or 1 to 2, then that has to be evidenced with something written by you. And wherever you're saying that a stage has increased, then that needs to correlate with the candidate submission. So if the candidate has moved from a 2 to a 3 in a particular area, you can put that, but if the candidate hasn't submitted a development log that relates to that and say what they've actually done, then your supervisor is going to pick up on that and they're going to query where this change has come from and, you know, not be as confident in your scoring and your evidence as they might have been because there's no corresponding evidence from the candidate. One thing to bear in mind about the upcoming mentor reviews for quarter 3, you probably all know this and are sick of me telling you, but all the mentor reviews for quarter 3, if your candidate had made a submission previously, all these scores last quarter, which are on the left-hand side of the columns of dots, they will all have reset to 0. Okay, and that's been done because there's no mapping between the old syllabus and the new syllabus. So we couldn't, you know, where you'd given them a 3 for 1A2 or no, then 2A2, I suppose it would have been on the old syllabus, we couldn't say that that would correspond to 1B1 and give them a 3 for that on the new syllabus because there just isn't that mapping across. So you will need to spend a bit of extra time doing the mentor review for quarter 3. Even if your candidate was quite advanced, you'll still need to spend some time just thinking about how their knowledge on the old syllabus does move across to the new syllabus. Now here we have the mentor review, so you can see what I'm actually talking about. So those of you that haven't done one yet, this is what it looks like. It's essentially a lot like the initial review, except you've got these scores last quarter. And unlike this one here, all the scores last quarter will be in the 0 column. And so it'll be up to you to then go through and put down your 1s and your 2s and your 3s, and possibly, but very unlikely, 1, 4 perhaps for those extraordinarily good candidates. Then you'll add some text describing you know, what has happened to cause this change, and then also because on the new syllabus you are only scoring candidates on the elements 1 to 4, you'll do this for elements 1 to 4, and then for elements 5 and 6, which you'll remember are called the underpinning elements, you'll just be asked to write some descriptive text. There's no scoring for the underpinning elements, just for the 4 core elements. Okay, let's just talk quickly about what your supervisor's looking for. It's essentially what I've been saying. They're looking for a succinct submission from your candidates, which is then backed up by verification that you have tested the candidate's knowledge in this area by asking them questions, by talking about how it would apply in a different context, perhaps, and then you write a bit about that to evidence what the candidate has said. They want things to be succinct, they need things to be on time, and they're also looking for evidence that you've both reflected on the previous supervisor feedback. Now, reflecting on it doesn't mean that you have to 100% agree with it or thank them for it or anything like that. If you're not finding your supervisor feedback helpful, then say so, because that's feedback to the supervisor and they can then use that to formulate more precise feedback for next time. If you want to query something, you can do that in your comments about how you've responded to the feedback from the supervisor. If you would like more detail or guidance on a particular area, you can comment on that on your mentor review, and the candidate can in their quarterly statement. Okay, so it's entirely a two-way process, and as mentors, you have got the supervisor's email address in your My Candidates list on the right-hand side of the table. So if you do ever want to contact them with a technical question, then you've got their email address there. Generally, if it's a general question about the process, about deadlines, submissions, anything to do with that, then I will be able to answer it, and it's generally faster for me to respond than it is for the supervisor. So I said we come back to this notification and exam standard. This is from the guidebook. So candidates are expected to have a minimum of stage 2 across the majority of the syllabus. We say majority, we don't give a percentage or a proportion. They may still have stage 1 in a small number of areas. Again, no number given, because this entirely depends on what the candidate is doing. In the past, even on the old pathway, but certainly under PPE, it was quite prescriptive that all the candidates had to have the same knowledge profile. On the new pathway, it entirely depends on what the candidate is doing. So if your candidate is not doing any planning at all, they may well have a few months in sections of the syllabus to do with planning, or if they're doing no contracts, then they may not have any have some ones in the contracts area. They can't have any zeros. A single 0 is enough to get a notification declined, so always bear that in mind. But a few stage 1s is fine. Now, here's the important bit. Stage 3 will have been achieved in areas relating to the candidate's specific area of expertise. So the examiners are looking to you, the mentor, to define what the candidate's specific area of expertise is by indicating that with 3s in your mentor review. Okay, and the examiners will then expect the candidate to be able to show a level 3 level of knowledge in those areas during the exam, and the candidate will fail if they can't show that. Okay, even if they're a minimum of stage 2 everywhere else. If they can't show any areas at stage 3, they will fail. So really need to be selective with those level 3s, and it's something that we were having a problem with on the old pathway syllabus, that a lot of mentors, well not a lot, but a small number, significant number of mentors would grade their candidates all 3s, and inevitably a couple of these people would fail at the exams each time they went forward, and they often wouldn't be able to show knowledge much above stage 1 because the mentors hadn't been assessing their knowledge appropriately or hadn't been paying attention to what the stage definitions were. Okay, so these are the stage, this is the stage profile that we ask people to have when they're coming to the exam. And this is the stage profile that you need to have when a notification is submitted, but it's also exactly what the examiners are looking for. So there's no difference between what we're looking for to get a notification approved and also when the exam actually takes place. Now, there are some pitfalls to be avoided, and this is a refresher training for mentors, so it's best to get these out in the open. Marking all stages as 3, or even marking a stage as 3 before it actually is, major pitfall. It can wrongly boost the candidate's confidence. They think that they don't need to do as much work as they actually need to. And then they therefore turn up at the exam unprepared. Okay, we see that at each exam. It will happen to a couple of candidates, and it's terribly upsetting for them and a huge shock. And so it's just best to be avoided. I'm sure none of you would do this, but it is a pitfall. Assuming knowledge, as I was saying before, if you've seen someone doing something in the office or heard that they've done something really well, that means that they're good at it. That's absolutely fine, but can they talk about it? Can they talk about it as a theory? Can they talk about it being applied? Can they talk about it being applied in a slightly different professional context? Trusting that knowledge will improve shortly. This is one that I see quite often in submissions that I look at, where someone is about to go on a course, perhaps one of the Tenant Garnery courses or a Colin Moore course or something like that, and it's assumed that that will improve the candidate's knowledge in an area. Now, first of all, the candidate may break their leg and not be able to go on the course, so we should never preempt the candidate's level of knowledge. Second of all, and I'm not saying they are, but the course might be useless and therefore not boost their knowledge. Third of all, the candidate may fall asleep, may not reflect, may just not find it very useful at all, however good the course is. So never try and preempt the knowledge that the candidate is about to gain. The fourth one is very similar to the second, believing that someone's ability to do something is the same as their ability to communicate it, often certainly not the case. And again, thinking that experience is the same as knowledge. We've had recently a couple of very experienced people in their 50s who have been landscape architects for 30 years, and they've moved beyond the basics, which means that they are often unable to talk about the theory because they're much more involved now in the policy or the politics. So experience doesn't necessarily mean that they have the required knowledge. It's no doubt that they have knowledge, but it's not necessarily the knowledge that they need to demonstrate during the exam. So there's just a few pitfalls to avoid. Now, I say it's never too late, or never too early rather, certainly never too late to think about the exam. The exam itself, there will be two examiners and a monitor. I managed to distract myself magnificently by having this ghastly animated clock. Well, that's not helping either anyway. We'll just have to live with that, I suppose. Anyway, so no, I'm doomed. I'm doomed to the clock. I'll just look away. Anyway, two examiners and perhaps a monitor in the room. So this is all something to bear in mind when you're assessing your candidate's knowledge and also when you're holding mock exam. It'll be an unfamiliar room to the candidate. It'll be a perfectly nice room, but it won't be a situation that they necessarily feel comfortable in. They won't know the people. We check conflicts of interest with each of the examiners to make sure that's the case. And they may well be stressed or nervous. Even the most confident candidate can turn into a bundle of nerves when they get into these situations, because they'll have been working towards it for months, if not years, and it all comes down to the next 45 minutes. I've seen everything you can imagine in the waiting room. I've seen crying, I've seen fainting, I've seen anger, I've seen, well, just everything. But anyway, it's probably fortunately difficult to replicate this kind of situation. So this is why it's important to test the candidate's knowledge and really make sure that they do have this level of knowledge that they need to have. It's really important as well to hold mock exams, because for the candidate to sit around writing out answers to sample questions, as we all probably used to with our GCSEs or A-levels or a degree or whatever it was we last took, it's useful to write out sample answers, but as I've been saying, it's not the same as actually talking. Talking is much faster than writing. So it's really important all the way through, really, that your candidate has, where's my slides have stopped, here we go. Really important that your candidate has this chance to practice what goes on in, yes, my slides have just broken at this point, to practice what will go on in the exam. Now, the presentation is telling me that I've finished, but I thought I had a few more slides to go. So let me just see whether this is the presentation just being cute with me, or whether they've somehow dropped out. No, they've somehow dropped out. So what I'll do is, bear with me, I'll just get rid of this. Yes, I want to do that. No, I don't want to save it. And we'll just share what's going on in PowerPoint over here. So let's just go into that. I hope you can all see that. Let me just make that full screen. There we go. So these are the rest of the slides that WebEx had managed to take off. As I've been saying, it's absolutely essential to have this oral practice. It's very important. It's not just simple recall of what they're talking about. It's also putting it into more unfamiliar professional context, not unprofessional context. And always remember that for stage 3, they will be under pressure in the exam, and they need to be able to talk about how they have applied their knowledge, how they've taken responsibility, and how they've acted with no supervision. And, you know, that they are then able to transfer that to other contexts as well. Okay, so these are all things to bear in mind when you're trying to test what your candidate is able to do. So that actually is the end of what I wanted to talk about. So let's just move on and have a quick review of what we've covered. Now, this is just a refresher for mentors, so it's not designed to be the entire mentoring experience. If you were hoping I'd talk more about the syllabus, remember that there is the Introduction to Pathway 2.0 webinar on YouTube, as well as linked to from the Pathway Resources area. If you're on YouTube, search for Landscape Institute UK, all one word, and you'll find all our videos. There's still the ones relating to the Olympics up there, SUDS, and all sorts of other things. So the Introduction to Pathway 2.0 talks a lot more about the syllabus. And there are in fact 3 other webinars next week, one of which is mentoring for beginners. So if you're hoping I would go into a bit more detail, there's always that. But what I've covered today is what the pathway is and the pathway life cycle. We've also talked about deadlines, and I'm very much hoping that you'll be adding those to your diary now. We've talked about candidate submissions, and really it comes down to when your candidate is submitting a vast amount of text, are they actually wasting not just their time but your time as well, because they're asking you to read this. And if they don't need to be including all that detail about what it was they did, when what is important is what they learned from it, then that's something to discuss with your mentor. We talked about the stage definitions, 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Remember that 4 is extremely unlikely, and it's 2 and 3 that you need to focus on. We've talked about assessing your candidate's knowledge and how you need to be doing that orally. Really important, that, can't emphasize it enough. And lastly, we talked about the mentor review, what the supervisors need to see from it, and also we talked a little bit about the exam as well, just to finish off there. Now, all of this information is in the guidebook, along with umpteen other resources on the Pathway website, which includes a document on setting up an oral exam, a mock oral exam. So you might find that useful if you've got a candidate being examined in November or thinking about May next year. But as I say, that is everything I wanted to cover. So I'm going to now have a look at the chat window and see what has appeared in there. So let's just have a look at that. Aidan has said, I assume then that mentors shouldn't put forward candidates without any stage 3 scores. Yes, actually that's absolutely right, and the supervisors should reject nominations for candidates who haven't got any stage 3 scores. Aidan, you're absolutely right. I will be emphasising this to mentors and candidates in coming months, and it will also come up at the supervisor training, which is being held on the 25th of September later this month. So yes, candidates who don't have any 3s won't have their notification approved, and candidates who can't show knowledge at stage 3 in any area will fail the exam. So yes, that's a good way to summarise it, and in fact I'll make sure that that's emphasised in more detail in documents and so on as we go forward. So yes, thank you for that, Aidan. That's actually the only question that I've been asked in the chat window so far, and that's not unusual, I have to say. It's no reflection on this group, because people tend to be fairly stunned by the time we get to the end of these things, because it's a bit of an information, well, download, I suppose. But anyway, that's everything I've been asked. So if there aren't any other questions to be submitted in the chat, then I'll call it a day and stop the recording. Thank you all very much for attending. I hope you found this useful. If you've got any feedback that you'd like to send me, then please do email it to the pathway@landscapeinstitute.org email address. But I'm sorry about the slides being all funny there at the end, but I'm glad that we were able to find that last one. Just on making the emphasis on oral communication. So I've stopped sharing that PowerPoint file. We're at an end, and I will say goodbye. All right, I hope you all have a good evening. Bye.